My name, as it was writ in my father's Bible, is Eleanor Jane Whitman. I was born March the 4th, in the year of our Lord 1842, on a patch of Ohio ground some 20 miles east of Columbus, where the soil runs dark and deep and a body's hands never stay clean past noon. I ain't much used to speakin' into contraptions such as this one. The gentleman settin' it up told me to mind the horn and talk plain, as if I were speakin' to a neighbor across the fence, so that's what I aim to do. If my voice shakes some, you'll pardon it. I've held this tale in my chest longer than most folks keep breath in their lungs. I was raised on a small farm, not grand, but steady. We kept 2 milk cows, a scatterin' of hens, and a stretch of corn that did well enough when the rain remembered us. Our house leaned a touch to the west, like it was forever bowin' to the wind. In winter the boards creaked and the stove glowed red, and in summer the windows stayed flung wide to let the smell of hay and creek water drift through. It weren't a rich life, but it was a full one. I knew the sound of my mother's tread afore she spoke, and the weight of my father's hand on my shoulder when I'd done right. We worked hard, we prayed harder, and we reckoned that was the order God set for decent folk. I was Eleanor Jane Whitman then. At 16 years old, I became Eleanor Jane Clark, standin' in a church with a borrowed veil and a pair of gloves that didn't quite fit my hands. That was the day my name changed, and folks say a girl's life turns on such a day. They'll tell you that's when she steps from childhood into woman's burdens. But I tell you plain, that weren't the day my life truly changed. No, sir. The day that set the course of all the years that followed came later, quiet as frost settlin' over a field. No preacher spoke, no ring was passed, no hymn was sung. It come in the form of words, words carried from one mouth to another, words that never should have left the first. It come from my brother. Now, a brother in those days weren't just kin, he was your playmate in youth, your helper in work, your shield in a world that didn't spare much kindness for girls. Mine was older by 4 years, tall and steady, with a way of Logan that could shake the dust from a room. I trusted him like a second conscience. If there was a thought in my head I feared to speak aloud, he was the one I'd whisper it to. And that, I reckon, is what made the wound cut so deep. There be things a young woman tells her brother thinkin' they'll rest safe between blood and bone, small fears, private hopes, truths not yet shaped for the world's ears. I had such a truth once, not a wicked thing, nor a shameful one, but delicate as spring ice. It weren't meant for strangers, nor for the family I'd marry into, nor for any soul outside the circle of trust one believed we shared. Yet somehow it traveled. I did not hear the moment it left his mouth. I did not see the road it took, but I saw the end of it plain enough, in the way eyes turned toward me different than before, in the hush that settled when I entered a room, in the feeling that something of mine had been carried off and set where it could not be gathered back. That was the true tenin of my life, not the weddin', not the leavin' of my father's house, not the bearin' of children nor the buryin' of kin. It was the day I learned that even blood may speak a word that cannot be unsaid. I have carried the sound of it through near all the seasons God granted me, through harvests and funerals, through births and winters, through the long slow changin' of this country from horse path to motor road. Folks think the world alters with machines and wires and lamps that burn without flame, but I tell you, the heart of a thing, trust, love, betrayal, that stays much the same. And if I'm to set this record down honest, if I'm to leave behind something truer than the polite stories folks pass along at funerals, I must begin where the wound began. For a brother's tongue, once loosed, can cut deeper than any stranger's hand. A brother's tongue can wound deeper than a stranger's knife. My brother Thomas weren't just kin to me, he was near the shape of safety itself when I was small. Folks talk of fathers as protectors, and mine surely tried, but Pa had fields to mind and weather to fret over, it was Thomas who walked beside me through the everyday parts of livin'. He was 4 years my elder and carried himself like he'd been born knowin' the weight of responsibility. When we hauled water from the well, he'd take the fuller bucket. When the wind howled nights and the shutters rattled, he'd be the one to check the latch while I stayed tucked beneath the quilt. I never asked him to do such things. He just did 'em, same as the sun rises without needin' permission. We shared most everything a farm childhood could offer. In summer we hoed rows side by side, dirt climbin' up our boots till Ma scolded us for trampin' it into the kitchen. In autumn we stacked wood, talkin' little and listenin' to the crows fuss overhead. Winter was when we grew closest, I reckon. Snow sealed the world tight, and evenings stretched long as a sermon. We'd sit by the stove, mendin' harness straps or shellin' beans, and he'd tell stories, some true, some stretched wide as river. Tales. I laughed more in those winters than any season since. Sundays, we walked to church together down the frozen road or the muddy lane. Dependin' on what season God had set before us, he always slowed his stride to match mine, though he could have reached the door 10 minutes sooner without me. When the preacher spoke of loyalty and family, I'd glance at Thomas and feel sure those words were carved special for him. There's a kind of trust that grows quiet-like over years. It ain't sworn in oaths or sealed in handshakes. It's built in the small moments, shared work, shared bread, shared silence. By the time I was near grown, I trusted my brother more than any other soul walkin' this earth, more than neighbors, more than kinfolk, even more than I trusted my own reckonin' some days. He knew my fears afore I spoke 'em, knew when I worried over Ma's health or fretted I weren't strong enough for the life ahead. If I cried, it was him who'd notice first, though I tried to hide it. He had a way of seein' straight through the parts of me I thought I'd tucked away. After Pa died, that closeness deepened into somethin' firmer still. Pa's passin' left the house hollowed out, like a tree struck by lightning but still standin'. Ma leaned into her grief quiet, foldin' it into work and prayer. I, bein' younger, felt the loss like a storm with no place to run from. It was Thomas the first spoke to then. I told him things I hadn't even shaped into full thoughts yet, how scared I felt of what would come next, how unsure I was of my place without Pa's steady voice in the house, how I feared bein' bartered into a future I didn't rightly choose. He listened, never mockin', never rushin' me, just noddin' slow like each word mattered. There's a strange comfort in believin' someone holds your truths safe. I gave mine to him piece by piece, thinkin' they'd rest there like seeds kept in a jar till spring. I told him my hopes, my doubts, the small secret wishes I'd never have dared breathe to anyone else. I reckon I believed blood itself made a vault no word could escape from. If I had a thought too tender for the open air, it went to Thomas. If I had a fear too sharp for Ma's already burdened heart, it went to Thomas. And when the world shifted after Pa's death, it was Thomas the first leaned on, sure as a fence post sunk deep in ground. Looking back now, I can see plain that trust was the very thing that gave his later words their power. For in those days, before any shadow crept in, before any careless tongue changed the shape of my life, I held one belief certain as Scripture. He was the only soul who knew the whole of me. There be truths a body carries that ain't meant for the wide world, nor even for the next room if the door stands thin. In the years after Pa passed, when the house felt too large for the three of us, I come to hold one such truth in my own chest. I didn't name it sin, nor crime, nor even folly. It was smaller than that, quieter, but in a place like ours, where folks weigh a girl's worth by what they believe of her, small things can tip a life clean sideways. It had to do with my future, though I didn't see it plain at the time. Girls then weren't asked what path they'd choose. The path was laid afore us same as furrows in a field. A decent name, a decent husband, a steady home, that was the measure set down. Any whisper against that name could sour the whole prospect. I had once given a word, not a vow before preacher or law, but a young girl's promise spoken soft by a fence line one summer dusk. It weren't solemn in the eyes of men, yet in my own reckoning it had weight. The boy had gone west with his kin afore anything could come of it, and time wore the memory thin as cloth washed too often. Still, I'd spoke the promise, and I knew in my heart I'd meant it when it left my lips. I never thought it would matter after. Life moved on as life does. Suitors come to call, neighbors pass opinions, and Ma began speaking of my future in tones that sounded more like plans than hopes. I didn't tell her of that old promise. It felt too foolish by then, too far gone to carry any meaning. But it lingered in me same as a scar beneath a sleeve, unseen, yet felt. Thomas knew of it, though. I'd told him one winter night when the wind rattled the eaves and sleep wouldn't come. I spoke at half-Logan, sayin' how childish it all sounded now. He'd listened quiet, same as always, then nodded and said, "A word's a word, Maggie, even if the world don't hear it." I took that as kindness, not warning. I figured the matter would rest there, tucked safe in the space between us like so many other confidences. But a girl's reputation in those days weren't built on what she did so much as what folks thought she might have done. When a new suitor began visitin', a respectable man, steady, with land prospects and a name that carried weight, Ma's hopes rose like bread in a warm oven. I saw it in the way she straightened the tablecloth when he came, and how she watched me close, measurin' my words and posture. To her, this weren't courtship alone, it was security, salvation, and future all wrapped in one. And I kept silent. Not from deceit, but from fear of stirrin' a past that seemed already laid to rest. I reckoned what was gone needn't be summoned back, and what had been spoken in youth held no force in the world of grown folk. I believed, foolish as it sounds now, that silence could smooth over what truth might trouble. But silence don't bury a thing if another soul's holdin' the spade. I never learned what moved Thomas to speak of it, nor how exactly he framed the tale. Maybe he thought honesty was duty, maybe he reckoned a husband ought know every corner of a wife's past, or maybe he spoke careless, not grippin' how words shift shape once they leave a friendly ear. All I know is this, what I'd trusted to his keeping found its way beyond him. And once spoken aloud, it weren't my small, half-forgotten promise any more. It grew teeth in the tellin'. It sounded larger, heavier, nearer scandal than sentiment. Folks don't pass along a story in the shape it was born. They trim it, stretch it, dress it in suspicion till it hardly resembles its first form. By the time it circled back to me, it felt like hearing a stranger's life recited in my name. The suitor's visits grew shorter after that. His tone cooled, polite but guarded, as if he'd discovered rot beneath fresh paint. Ma's smile tightened when he called, and I saw in her eyes the quick arithmetic of worry. Reputation, once cracked, don't mend easy in a farming county where news travels faster than wagons. I never accused Thomas, never even asked him straight what he'd said. Some things, once broken, speak loud enough without questionin'. What I'd carried as a small, private truth had slipped loose into a world eager to make more of it than it ever was, and I come to learn that day how fragile a woman's standing can be, not in what she's done, but in what's told of her. It was a small truth in my mouth, but a ruinous one in the wrong ears. I was 16 the day I took the name Clark. 16 ain't an age for knowin' the world, but it's old enough to feel when the ground under you ain't steady. Still, a girl in our county didn't wed for romance alone. She wed for shelter, for bread through winter, for the promise that her days might run smoother than her mother's had, and I'll not pretend I didn't hope for some measure of kindness too. Mr. Clark was a sober man, steady in his speech and careful with his hands, not cold, not unkind, just measured, like a fellow who'd weighed most things in life afore speaking on 'em. That suited Ma well enough. she said steadiness fed a household better than charm, and I'd been raised to trust her reckonin'. The weddin' itself was modest, a borrowed ribbon in my hair, neighbors gathered, the preacher speakin' the words that turn a girl into a wife faster than her heart can follow. When I said my vows, my voice sounded strange to my own ears, like I'd stepped outside myself to hear another woman speak. Clark. The name settled on me like a coat not yet broke in. It fit, but stiffly. I told myself that was natural, a new home, new duties, new expectations. A body don't slide into such things without some shiver of doubt. I held tight to the notion that stability would grow with time, same as crops once they take root. I believed a steady man could build a steady life, and I was willin' to learn my place in it. For the first few days, things moved quiet and proper. His mother received me polite enough. His sister asked after my cookin', and his father spoke little but nodded when I passed. It weren't warm, exactly, but it weren't unfriendly neither, I thought. This is how new beginnings feel, cautious, but sound. Then something shifted. It weren't loud, no quarrel, no harsh word, just a turn, slight as a hinge movin' slow. Conversations hushed when I stepped near. His mother's smile tightened at the corners, as if she'd swallowed something sour she couldn't spit out. His sister watched me longer than before, weighing me in ways I couldn't name. Clark himself grew quieter too, not distant, just thoughtful in a manner that felt guarded. He'd study me sometimes like he was tryin' to read a line writ too faint. When I spoke, he listened polite, but the ease I'd glimpsed at first never quite returned. I didn't know the cause, not then. But I felt it. A woman knows when she's bein' measured against something she ain't been told about. I learned later, not through confession nor open word, but through the sort of sideways truths that slip out over years, that my brother had spoken with Clark's family afore the weddin' day, not in anger, nor even malice. From what I gather, he'd thought it right, perhaps, that they know every corner of the girl joinin' their house. Maybe he believed honesty built stronger marriages. Maybe he never guessed how a half-told thing can twist once it lands among strangers. Whatever his aim, the talk reached them. And though no one ever flung it at me outright, I saw its shadow settle in their looks, a caution where there'd been welcome, a question where there'd been acceptance, not scandal enough to halt the match, but weight enough to change the air. I stepped into that house as a bride, yet felt, before a fortnight passed, like a guest who'd overstayed her invitation. I kept my head high, same as Ma taught me. I worked hard, spoke gentle, and gave no cause for complaint outwardly. Nothin' in our life showed fracture. The fields needed tendin', meals needed cookin', winters still came whether hearts felt warm or not, and Clark. He treated me fair, never cruel, never sharp, just careful, as if some part of him stood watch I couldn't see. That's the way of such wounds. They don't always bleed where a body can point to 'em. Sometimes they settle quiet in the walls, chillin' the place bit by bit. I come to understand, slow as frost creepin' across a windowpane, that whatever my brother had said weren't forgotten. It lingered like a draft through the boards, unseen, but always there. And I learned then a thing that's followed me near my whole life. A house can grow cold without a door ever opening. It come to light on a gray mornin' in late autumn, the sort where the sky hangs low and the ground smells of damp leaves and old straw. I remember the sound of the pump creakin' outside, and the way the kettle near about boiled itself dry whilst I stood watchin' the steam curl. Clark sat at the table already, hat laid beside him, though he weren't fixed to go nowhere yet. That alone told me something weighed on him. A man don't keep his hat close indoors unless he feels he might need it soon. He didn't start harsh, nor loud, that weren't his manner. He spoke my name soft, like he was testin' it for truth. "Eleanor," he said, eyes steady but not unkind, there's a matter been brought to me, and I'd sooner hear it plain from you than carry half knowledge in my house." My hands stopped where they were, still damp from the basin. I didn't ask what matter, didn't need to. He told me then, not every word my brother had used, but enough to know the secret I'd once trusted to kin had traveled farther than my own voice ever meant it to go. And in that instant, I understood. Not with shock, not with a burst of anger or grief, just a quiet, hollow settlin', like when a board in the floor finally gives after years of creakin'. The moment don't thunder, it just drops. I sat down opposite him, slow and careful, and folded my hands in my lap so he wouldn't see the tremble. The room felt smaller than it had the day afore, though not a stick had moved. He asked me if it were true. I nodded. No long speech, no tears, just the truth, laid plain as bread on a board. I told him what there was to tell, not more, not less. He listened without interruption, eyes fixed the whole while, as if he aimed to weigh every syllable. When I finished, the silence that followed stretched wide. I could hear the wind rubbin' against the side of the house, the faint tick of the clock, the far-off bark of a neighbor's dog, sounds I'd heard daily, yet never so sharp as then. He didn't accuse me, didn't raise his voice. But he asked one question that carried more weight than any shout could have held. Why was I not told afore? And that, more than the secret itself, struck deep. I could have answered a dozen ways: fear, youth, uncertainty, the hope that the past might lie still if left undisturbed, all true enough, but none felt fit for speaking aloud. So I said only that I had been young and uncertain how much of one's history must be handed over to build a future. He nodded slow, as if he understood part but not the whole. Then he said, near under his breath, "Your brother believed it right I should know." There it was. Not a guess, not rumor, certainty. And though he didn't say my brother's name sharp nor bitter, it settled heavy between us like a third presence at the table. I felt no blaze of rage then, no urge to storm or cry, just a stillness so deep it near felt like sleep, the kind that comes when a body knows the shape of a thing long afore it's named. I realized, in that quiet, that I'd known this day would come the moment my brother first looked at me after hearing my confession years before. There'd been a shift in him even then, a sense he carried my story not as a burden shared, but as a duty waiting its hour. I never asked him why he told. Never cornered him, never demanded account. Truth be told, I didn't need to. I knew him. He was a man who prized righteousness the way some prize gold. To his mind, truth unspoken festered, and honesty, no matter the cost, was the cleanest road. He believed he'd done the proper thing, same as he'd always believed he must stand straight before the Lord and man alike. He hadn't meant cruelty. That's what made it cut deeper. Had he acted from spite, I might have found anger enough to fight it, but he spoke from conviction, and conviction wears the face of virtue. It leaves no place to throw blame that sticks. Clark rose after a time and went out to the yard, sayin' he needed air. I stayed where I was, listenin' to the screen door creak and fall shut, knowin' that somethin' in our life had shifted permanent-like. Not shattered. Just altered in a way that don't mend back whole. I sat there a long while, hands still folded, thinkin' on how a single word carried beyond its rightful circle can travel years before landin', and how once it does, it can't be gathered up again. I never asked my brother for his reason. Never pressed him for apology. Some reckon that strange. But I'd known him too long to require explanation. His sense of duty was plain as scripture, and I'd seen it guide him in matters smaller than this. So when the truth reached my husband's ears, I didn't wonder how or why. I only understood that the road between my brother and me had quietly ended, though neither of us had marked the milepost when it passed. Because sometimes the heart grasps a thing complete the moment it happens. Some answers arrive without words. I saw him one last time not long after the matter come out into the open. It weren't staged nor planned, just one of those meetings life sets before you whether you wish it or no. It was early spring, mud season still clinging to the roads, when the frost leaves ruts deep as memory. I'd gone back toward my mother's place to fetch a small chest of linens she'd promised me before my wedding. I recall the sky was pale and thin, the sort that makes every sound carry farther than it ought. He stood by the fence when I come up the path, coat unbuttoned though the air still bit. For a moment he looked just the same as he had when we were young, tall, steady, hands braced on the rail like he'd spent his life leanin' there watchin' the fields grow. He said my name plain, not soft, not sharp. Eleanor. I stopped a few paces off, didn't step nearer, didn't turn away neither. We stood like that a spell, both of us feelin' the weight of all that had passed without either knowin' how to set it down. He spoke first. Said he'd meant no harm, said he'd prayed over it more than once, said a husband ought to know the full truth of the woman he took into his house, said he believed he'd acted righteous, though he'd known it might cost him my favor. His voice weren't proud, it weren't defensive neither, just steady, like a man givin' account before a judge he respects. I listened, didn't interrupt. When he finished, the wind moved through the bare branches overhead, rattlin' them like dry bones. I remember thinkin' how strange it was that the world kept right on with its ordinary noises while somethin' so large had shifted between us. I asked him only one thing. Did you reckon it would help me? He said yes, said truth builds a firmer house than silence, said better a marriage tested early than poisoned later, said he believed I'd thank him in years to come, once I saw the wisdom of it. That was the moment I knew we'd crossed a line no word could mend. Cruelty, you see, carries heat with it, it flares, it burns, it shows its face plain. A cruel act can be fought, shouted against, even forgiven once its fire dies down. But what he offered weren't cruelty. It was certainty. He stood there convinced he'd done me good, convinced he'd guarded my soul, even if he'd bruised my heart, and there's a loneliness in being wounded by someone who calls it kindness that cuts deeper than any spiteful blow. I told him as much, though not in anger. I said, if you'd struck me, I might have healed quicker, but you've judged me, and a judgment don't fade same as pain. He looked troubled then, like a man who's found the map he trusted don't match the road beneath his feet. He said he was still my brother, said blood don't change for one mistake. I reckon he meant it sincere. But somethin' in me had gone quiet by then, not hardened, just settled, like a door eased shut without slammin'. I told him I wished him well, told him I hoped the Lord would grant him peace in his choices. Then I turned. Didn't wait for reply, didn't look back to see if he watched me go. The mud clung to my boots heavy as lead, yet each step felt certain. I walked away from that fence, from that yard, from the last thread that tied my grown life to the child I'd once been beside him. And I never returned. Not for holidays, not for illness, not even when word come years later that he'd asked after me. I bore him no public malice, spoke no ill of him to neighbors nor kin. I simply let the space stand, wide and permanent, same as a river that's changed course and won't be coaxed back. Some losses announce themselves with thunder. Others arrive quiet, the way dusk comes, so gradual you scarce notice till the light's gone. That day by the fence, I understood I weren't only leavin' a man behind. That day I lost not a brother, but a witness to my childhood. 50 years is a long stretch of road for one heart to travel, and I reckon mine wore down its soles on it. I bore children in that time, some in the spring mud, one in a winter so bitter the well froze solid, and we melted snow in kettles just to wash the babe. We moved twice, once for better soil and once because the fever took half the town and no one wished to stay where the church bell tolled so often it near sounded like a clock. I worked, same as any woman does. I scrubbed floors till my knuckles split in January air. I stitched shirts by lamplight when the oil ran low. I sang hymns over cradles and whispered prayers over graves, from the outside. There was no lack in my life that a neighbor could point to. Folks called me steady, said I kept a warm house and a firm table, and I did. I made certain my children knew laughter, knew the taste of summer peaches, knew the feel of safe hands guiding them across icy roads. But there was a room inside me I kept locked fast. I never named it aloud, didn't need to. I knew where it sat, somewhere behind the ribs, somewhere close enough to ache when the wind shifted just so. In that room I kept all the words I never spoke, all the questions I never asked, and one face I would not let myself remember too clearly. My children knew I once had a brother. That much slips out, same as smoke through a loose shutter. They'd ask, now and again, in the careless way young ones do. Where does he live, Mama? Does he have children too? Why don't he visit? And I'd give them the sort of answers that settle nothing but end a conversation. I'd say he was far off. I'd say life carries folks in different directions. I'd say not every road crosses back on itself. They learned, quick enough, that my voice turned flat as winter ground when they asked, and so they stopped. I never spoke his name in my house again, not once, not in anger, not in prayer, not even when I was alone with the churn and the ticking clock. A name has a way of breathing life into memory, and I could not bear to give that breath. At first, the silence felt heavy, like carrying a pail filled too near the brim. Every step you fear you'll spill something you cannot gather back. I'd wake some nights with the past laid out before me as plain as frost on glass. I'd see the fields we ran through as children, hear the creak of the barn door, feel the press of his hand steadying me on church steps. Those memories would come uninvited, and I'd lie there stiff as a board till dawn chased them off. But years are patient teachers. Little by little, the silence settled into me like a second skin. It stopped chafing, stopped feeling like something I carried, and started feeling like something I simply was. When sorrow knocks long enough, you either answer it or you learn to sleep through the sound. I learned to sleep. That ain't to say I forgot. Forgetting is a mercy some are granted, but it never came my way. I remembered plenty. I remembered how his laugh sounded when he was young. I remembered the way he'd tip his hat too low when he was nervous. I remembered the last look he gave me, standing there with his hands hanging useless at his sides. But I folded those memories small and put them where they could do no wandering. Life went on, same as it does for everyone. Seasons turned, children grew tall and left my table for their own. My husband's hair went from brown to ash, and mine followed suit. The world changed in ways small and large, but the quiet I kept never changed with it. And after a time, I could not say when exactly, it became easier to hold that quiet than to break it. Truth is a sharp thing. It cuts its way out once spoken, and it don't always stop where you mean it to. Silence, though, silence is a blanket. It covers what you lay beneath it. It lets a body move through the world without stirring old dust. So I chose the blanket, chose it again and again, till it no longer felt like a choice at all. And that is how I lived my years, not unhappy, not bitter, just carrying one sealed chamber where no voice ever echoed. Folks say time heals most wounds, and maybe that's so for some. Time smoothed the edges of my hurt, wore it down till it no longer bled at every touch. But there are things time does not mend. Time dulls pain, but it does not return trust. I learned early, on cold Sunday mornings when the pews were stiff and the frost pressed against the windows, that the ministers had a fondness for telling us what forgiveness ought to look like. They'd rise in their black coats, clear their throats, and say things like, "Forgive as the Lord forgives you, and bear no grudge in your heart." I'd nod along, clutching my hymn book so tight the paper cut my palm once, but I felt nothing stirring inside me at first, only the chill of the church and the weight of expectation. I prayed, too, in the same dutiful way, hands folded, eyes downcast, words recited, because that's what a good soul did when the organ hummed low and the preacher's voice softened toward the end of the sermon. "Forgive them, Father, as you have forgiven me," I would say, though inside I held the memory of his face, my brother's, and the silence we'd sworn between us. At first, prayer was a duty, a task like milking the cow or fetching water from the well, but the more I said it, the more I felt a loosening in my chest, as if the words themselves were oil poured over rusted iron. It didn't change him, didn't make him repent, didn't bring him to my door. It didn't undo the years of quiet, the moments of loss and the doors I never opened, but it changed me. That is the strange thing about forgiveness. It doesn't ask for return. It simply frees the one who gives it. I could walk through my days without the constant ache of betrayal pressing my shoulder down. I could speak to my children without the weight of a grudge clouding my tongue. I could sit by the hearth on winter nights and breathe without remembering, at every inhale, the hurt that had split my home in two. I forgave him in my heart, but I never spoke his name aloud again. God knows all, and I leave him to him. I do not seek vengeance, nor do I pine for reconciliation. The Lord, in his wisdom, can carry the measure of a man's conscience far better than any sibling, wife, or child can, and in leaving him to God, I found the release of my own soul. Some folks might think that forgiveness demands reunion, that you must open your door, invite the betrayer into your life, or bend the knee before them as if nothing ever happened. That is not what the Lord teaches, though some will twist his words to suit their comfort. Forgiveness is an act of mercy, a shedding of bitterness from your own heart, not a calling back of the hand that struck you. It is a letting go of the tether that binds you to another's cruelty. I carried that lesson in my bones, in the way I rose from the table and swept the hearth clean, in the way I tucked my children under blankets at night and kissed their foreheads with a calm I had to forge myself. There were sermons that lingered in my mind long after the preacher's voice faded. He spoke of the prodigal, of mercy shown even when undeserved. He spoke of carrying no grudges, of offering love where it might not be returned. I tried to emulate it. Sometimes it was just standing in the kitchen, rolling dough, and letting the memory of betrayal rise like yeast in the air, and then speaking a blessing over the bread without a thought toward him. Other times it was kneeling at my bedside, whispering the Lord's Prayer with a quiet insistence, my lips moving while my heart had long been freed. I tell you, it is a strange sort of freedom. One does not clamor for it in the fleshly world. One finds it in the small spaces between work and nightfall, in the hushed corners where one might otherwise have fumed. And when the burden of anger lifted, I felt lighter. I felt older and wiser, though not softened into weakness. I carried the memory, but it did not carry me. It was a book closed, left on a shelf where I could glance at it now and again, but never open it to poison the air again. I do not tell this as confession, nor as lesson. I tell it because it is the truth of living with a betrayal so intimate it could have cracked the heart from its first beating. The Lord commands mercy, not reunion. That is a teaching I have held close these many years, and in holding it close, I found that though the world may shift and men may err, a soul can walk upright even when the doors of trust are forever shut. I pray, I work, I love my children, I tend my hearth, and I speak little of the past, but I carry within me the knowledge that mercy does not require return, and that is enough. enough to fill my chest with warmth when the winter wind rattles the shutters, enough to keep my children safe in the way I never was, enough to remind me that the heart, once it forgives, may finally rest, even if the hand that wounded it never offers amends. I suppose I ought to begin by saying I never was accustomed to talking to such a contraption. They call it a recording machine, though to my mind it is more like a curious box with a tongue of its own, listening while one speaks and taking no notice of the hesitation or tremble in your voice. I set myself before it, hands folded in my lap, and felt the weight of years pressing down on me. In 1934, I am a woman who has walked a long and crooked road, and this machine sits before me as if expecting my life to be poured out neat and tidy, like beans into a measuring cup. I have outlived nearly all who knew the story I bear. Friends, neighbors, kinfolk, most have gone to the churchyard or scattered like seeds on the wind. There are children still living, grandchildren even, but they know only the echo of my life, not the substance. And so, it falls upon this machine to carry my words forward, a witness in place of the absent ears that once would have leaned close to hear them. I find myself speaking to it awkwardly at first, as if I were confessing to a stranger who could not interrupt or nod, could not shake its head in disbelief or pity. The world has changed. I note it every day I rise and step outside. The roads, once rough with mud in the spring and slick with frost in winter, are now paved and wide. Lights stretch along them, bright and steady, marking the path for wagons and automobiles alike. Cities have grown taller, streets longer, and the air is heavy with the hum of engines and the clatter of progress. A woman who once walked beside her brother through drifts of snow, clutching her bonnet tight, now watches buses and trolleys rumble past, and sometimes wonders if the soul of the place has grown along with the streets. Yet, in spite of all this change, I cannot say the human heart has altered much. Men still speak with hidden meanings, and women still guard their secrets like winter stores of grain. Love remains a tender but brittle thing. Trust is given with caution, and betrayal, oh, betrayal, that is as swift and cutting as ever. Though the world is filled with marvels, electricity and motion, the ache of deception and the sting of a brother's false tongue remain unchanged. It is a curious contradiction to see progress everywhere and yet recognize that our hearts move on their old, familiar tracks, unheeding of engines and lights. I have spoken of forgiveness many times, but even now I recognize that the heart may forgive and yet remain wary. There is wisdom in the distance I maintain from those who have wounded. Though time softens the edges, it does not erase the memory. The machine sits silent, and I imagine it will carry my words far beyond the reach of those who knew me. I find it comforting, in a way, that these old sorrows may live in a box that does not speak back, that does not judge, that cannot betray the confidences I entrust to it. There is an odd solace in this modern contraption. When I was young, letters carried news and secrets alike. A slip of paper in the wrong hands could ruin a life. Now, voices can be stored, memories caught in a tongue that is not human, and still the essence of experience remains intact. I speak slowly, letting the years settle over each word, aware that my accent has thickened with Ohio soil and with time, that my voice bears the echoes of decades spent tending hearth and home, raising children, and enduring the quiet grief of a life half sealed by betrayal. I think of my brother sometimes. In this odd, mechanical witness of my own making, I will never see him again, never hear the hesitation in his voice or the excuse he might offer. The recording machine, unmoving and unjudging, holds no rancor, it simply listens. Perhaps in that I have found a kinship of sorts, one that the world, with all its new roads and shining lights, cannot provide. It is a reminder that while our lives are fleeting and our connections fragile, some measure of our stories can endure, if we take care to leave them where they may be heard by those willing to listen, whether flesh or iron. And as I reflect, looking back across the decades, I am struck by the constancy of human emotion. Men build roads and cities, they light the nights with bulbs and wires, yet a whisper of deceit, a secret shared when it should have been kept, a trust broken. Those are as potent today as they were when I was 16 and my life shifted on the words of one I loved. The world may spin faster, but the heart has not learned new tricks. People still guard their souls, and the wounds inflicted by kin can still ache long after the rest of the world has forgotten the moment. So I speak now into this machine, old and unfamiliar as it is, and I think of the passage of time, the transformation of fields into roads, the wooden houses into brick, the candlelight into electric lamps. I speak of betrayal, of forgiveness, of a life lived quietly yet fully, and I leave it here for anyone who comes after, for anyone who may understand that though the landscape of the world shifts and grows, the trials of the human spirit remain as they were. The machines are new, but the wounds are old. Well now, I reckon it is time to speak plainly, though the words tremble on my tongue, as they always have. I have spent a lifetime tending to the hearth and the children, to the men and women who look to me for guidance and care, and I do not say this lightly. My life was measured in duty more than in joy, in service more than in applause. I rose with the sun, and I lay my head down when the candles burned low, and in between, I labored to keep our family whole, to feed and clothe and instruct, to see the years pass with dignity and provision. It was not a glamorous life. I have no tales of grand adventure or of cities visited, only the quiet rhythm of home and the heavy weight of responsibility. Yet in all that, I did not squander my heart entirely. I bore the joys of children's laughter and the warmth of kinship. I walked through snow and rain, through hard winters that cut to the bone, and through summers that seemed eternal in their brightness. I built a life that, though shadowed by one betrayal, was filled with substance, with the kind of work that leaves its mark on the world without fanfare. And though I never spoke my brother's name aloud in my house, never whispered it in the presence of my children or in the company of friends, I did not regret it. Silence, I discovered, can be a sanctuary as well as a shield. For years I pondered the lesson that the Almighty had set before me. Though it was not written in Scripture in so many words, the lesson was clear in the ache that lingered long after the betrayal, in the quietude of my home, in the careful, measured kindness I gave to others. Sometimes forgiveness is for heaven, and distance is for earth. I have carried that saying in my heart as a lantern to guide me through the dark corners of memory. Forgiveness, I determined, belongs to God. It frees the soul, it smooths the edges of pain, it allows a woman like me to breathe without bitterness pressing upon her chest. But distance, distance is for living, for walking among the living without being swallowed by grief or rage. Distance keeps one safe, and sometimes, as I have learned, it is the only measure that preserves a heart from further injury. I bore his blood, yet I buried his voice. I kept his memory locked behind a door I would never open again. Some ties are sacred. I know this. A mother to her child, a husband to his wife, a bond forged in trust and tenderness. But some must be laid down. No matter how deeply they are etched into the flesh and marrow, there is a weight in knowing that a man who shared your earliest laughter and tears can choose to wield knowledge as a weapon, and that the only answer a woman may give is to step away, to close the door softly, to let the memory settle in the quiet corners of her mind. And so I ask, though the machine does not answer, and though the listeners of the future may judge or ponder in silence, if a brother breaks faith with you, must love still answer him? Must you give him the key to the chambers he once guarded for you, the confidence he once held sacred? Or is it just, in the measure of God's providence and human survival, to forgive in the heart, to leave mercy to heaven, and to walk your own path here upon the earth? I leave that question to the ears of those who will hear this, trusting that the lessons of a life lived quietly, devotedly, with care and caution, may stir reflection in others, as mine was stirred and bent by betrayal long ago. I pause now, and breathe, for the cylinder will not wait for more words than it can hold. My life has been long, and my story, though fraught with grief and tempered by distance, is told. The shadows of old wounds stretch long behind me, and I know that those who hear may carry a part of it with them, may ponder the measure of duty and of forgiveness, of love bound by blood and of love withheld in self-preservation. This is the end, the quiet close of a chapter written not in ink but in lived days, in hours counted in careful steps and measured breaths. My lips fall silent, and I leave these words to rest in the cylinder, a witness that cannot betray, that cannot scorn, that simply preserves, and in that preservation I trust that the truth of a woman's life, with all its loves and losses, its labors and its cautions, may speak to someone yet unborn, in a voice steadier than my own trembling one.